Before the first snow fell on Larkspur County, two sisters would find beneath a rotting barn floor the only proof that their father had ever loved them enough to plan for their survival. Before their brothers came back to finish what they started. Before the debt collectors and the man in the black coat arrived to take even that. This is the story of what Odessa and Ruth Calloway found in the dark, and what it cost them to keep it. Their father, Walton Calloway, had been dead 11 weeks when the letter came from the county clerk in Prescott, confirming what both sisters had already suspected in their bones. The will their brothers presented at the courthouse, signed and witnessed and filed with unsettling speed, left the house, the cattle, the tools, and every acre of the Calloway homestead to the two eldest sons, Marcus and Dade, and named the twin daughters heirs to nothing but a single line at the bottom of the page. Provision has been made for my daughters elsewhere. Nobody in Larkspur County had asked what elsewhere meant. Marcus and Dade certainly had not asked. They had simply loaded the good furniture onto a freight wagon within the month, sold off the milk cows to a rancher 2 counties over, and ridden out toward the railroad towns where a man with cash in his pocket could disappear into a new life without anyone asking uncomfortable questions about a will that had been drawn up only 9 days before their father's fever finally took him. That left Odessa and Ruth, 22 years old, identical enough that strangers in town still confused them, though anyone who knew the sisters well never made that mistake twice. Alone in a house that no longer technically belonged to them, with a barn their brothers had not bothered to claim, because it looked, from the outside, like nothing worth having. "They took the cows," Ruth said, standing in the yard the morning after the brothers rode out, her arms wrapped tight around herself against the early autumn chill. "They took Mother's mirror. They did not even take the barn." "The barn is falling down," Odessa said. "There's nothing in the barn but rot and empty stalls." She was wrong, but it would be 3 more days before either of them understood exactly how wrong she had been. The soft power test came first, the way it nearly always did in a town small enough that everyone's business traveled faster than the weather. A merchant named Presley Whitcomb, who ran the general store and the only working scale for weighing grain within 20 miles, called on the sisters within the week, ostensibly to offer his condolences, though the true purpose of his visit revealed itself within the first 5 minutes. "I'd be willing to extend you credit through the winter," Whitcomb said, seated at their kitchen table with his hat in his lap and an expression of practiced sympathy arranged carefully on his face. "Given the circumstances, 2 young women alone, no cattle, no clear income, it would be a kindness on my part, you understand, and I would only ask a small interest, and perhaps the deed to this house as collateral, should hard times make repayment difficult." "The house is not ours to offer as collateral," Odessa said evenly. "Our brothers hold the deed." "For now," Whitcomb said, and something in the way he said it made the hair on Ruth's arms rise. "Deeds change hands, Miss Calloway. Circumstances change. I would simply rather be the man extending kindness to you now than the man who watches you lose everything to someone less generous later." They declined his offer, politely, and watched him ride off with the particular dissatisfaction of a man who had expected easier prey, and it was that same evening, searching the barn for anything useful their brothers had overlooked, that Ruth's boot caught on an iron ring bolted flush into a floorboard beneath a decade of accumulated straw and dust. "Odessa, come look at this." They cleared the straw together with their bare hands, working in the fading light until the ring stood exposed. Cold iron, worn smooth by handling, set into a trapdoor that had been built with more care than anything else in that sagging barn. It took both of them, bracing their boots against the frame, to haul the door upward on hinges that groaned like something waking after a long sleep. A ladder descended into darkness. Odessa went first, a lantern in one hand, and what the light revealed at the bottom stopped both sisters cold in the mouth of that hidden room. Shelves lined every wall, floor to ceiling, packed with sealed jars of preserved vegetables, salted meat wrapped tight in oiled cloth, sacks of flour and dried beans stacked in careful rows. Enough food to carry 2 people through a hard winter and well into the next. And against the far wall, beneath a canvas tarp gone stiff with age, sat a wooden chest bound in iron, locked, heavier than either sister could lift alone. "He built this," Ruth whispered, her voice barely carrying in the close underground air. "He built all of this. Why would he never tell us?" Odessa knelt beside the chest, running her fingers over the lock, and found tucked into the seam of the canvas tarp a folded paper, brittle at the edges, addressed in their father's cramped, careful handwriting. "To my daughters, when you find this," they did not open the chest that night. They carried the letter upstairs instead, sat together at the kitchen table with a single candle burning low, and read their father's words for the first time since his funeral. "If you are reading this," he had written, "then I am gone, and your brothers have done exactly what I feared they would do the moment I am no longer here to stop them. I could not leave the land to you outright. Marcus made certain of that the year he threatened to contest any will that favored you over him, and I did not have the strength left in me to fight him in a courtroom while my lungs were failing. But I built something your brothers never thought to look for, because they never once thought either of you was worth looking after. This room has been 10 years in the making. Everything in it is yours. Use it wisely and trust no one who offers you kindness with a price attached." Ruth was crying before she finished reading it a second time. Odessa was not, though her hands had gone very still against the table. The particular stillness of a woman deciding, in real time, exactly what kind of person she intended to become now that the ground beneath her had shifted so completely. She thought of her father as she had last seen him, gray and thin in the bed by the window, his hands too weak by then to do more than pat the quilt when she sat beside him. She had assumed, in those final weeks, that his silence came from exhaustion alone. Now she understood it had come from something else, too. A decade of careful secrecy, so complete that even his dying breath had not been enough to loosen it. Only the paper he had left behind, folded and waiting for the 2 people he trusted most to be strong enough to find it. "He never once complained," Ruth said quietly, wiping her face with the back of her hand. "Not about Marcus, not about the debts, not about any of it. I thought it was because he did not have the strength left to fight, but he was fighting the whole time, just not where any of us could see." "That was always his way," Odessa said. "Quiet work, no boasting about it after. They sat with that for a long moment, the candle burning low between them, the wind picking up outside against the shuttered window, and something passed between the sisters in that silence that neither needed to put into words, a settling of resolve that would carry them through everything the winter still had waiting. "We tell no one," Odessa said finally. "Not Whitcomb, not the neighbors, not anyone in town. If word gets out that we have food enough to survive the winter and a locked chest besides, every debt collector and opportunist in this county will be at our door within a week." "What about the chest?" "We open it tomorrow when we have slept, and we are steady enough to think clearly about what to do with whatever is inside." What was inside, when they finally forced the lock the following morning, was more gold coin than either sister had ever seen in one place in her life, stacked and wrapped in cloth to keep the coins from shifting and clinking during transport, along with a second, shorter letter folded beneath the topmost layer. "This is not stolen," their father had written. "Every dollar was earned honestly across 10 years of selling cattle quietly to buyers outside the county, keeping the profit from your brothers and the tax assessor both. I did not trust banks after the panic took your mother's family fortune, and I did not trust your brothers with a single coin they had not earned themselves. This is your inheritance, whatever the courthouse paper says otherwise. Spend it slowly, spend it wisely. And remember that gold draws attention faster than almost anything else in this world, so guard your secret the way you would guard your own lives." The first person to nearly discover the secret was a widower named Ezekiel Marsh, who ran the county's only working forge and had known Walton Calloway since before either sister was born. He came calling not out of suspicion, but out of simple neighborly concern, having noticed smoke rising from the sisters' chimney at odd hours and firewood disappearing from their woodpile faster than two women living lean should reasonably need. "You're eating better than a house with no cattle and no income ought to be eating," Ezekiel said bluntly, standing in their doorway with his hat pushed back and his expression more curious than accusing. "I'm not here to pry into your business. I buried my own wife 3 winters back, and I know grief makes a person careful about who they trust. But if you're in some kind of trouble, I'd rather know now than read about it in the county paper later." Odessa studied him for a long moment, weighing the risk of honesty against the risk of a lie that might not hold, and found something in Ezekiel Marsh's plain, weathered face that reminded her enough of her own father that she made a decision she would not fully explain, even to Ruth, until later that night. "Our father left us something," she said carefully. "Something we intend to keep quiet, for reasons I think you can understand given how our brothers behaved. I am not asking you to help us. I am asking you not to speak of what you may have already guessed." Ezekiel nodded slowly. "Your father did me a kindness once that I never had the chance to repay before he passed. Lent me the coin to rebuild this forge after a fire took the old one, and never once asked for interest or a deadline. If his daughters need a quiet friend who knows how to keep his mouth shut, I reckon that debt just found its way to being repaid." He became, in the weeks that followed, the closest thing to family the sisters had left, teaching them without lecture or condescension how to manage tools their brothers had never bothered showing them, how to repair the sagging barn roof before winter worsened the damage, how to move through town without drawing the kind of attention that invited questions neither sister wanted to answer. He showed Ruth how to read the weather in the particular way clouds banked against the western ridge before a hard freeze, and he showed Odessa how to keep the ledgers of a working homestead in a hand precise enough to withstand any court's scrutiny, a skill she absorbed faster than he expected and put to use sooner than either of them anticipated. He never asked for payment beyond a plate at their table when the work ran long into evening, and he never once looked at either sister the way Whitcomb had, weighing her worth against what she might owe him later. "Your father used to say a debt repaid quiet is worth twice one repaid loud," Ezekiel told them one evening, working a length of rope through his calloused hands by the fire. "I expect that is why he built what he built, the way he built it. Man did not want gratitude. He wanted his daughters standing on their own 2 feet when he was gone, and no one the wiser about how they got there." It was Ezekiel who first mentioned, carefully, that Presley Whitcomb had been asking around town about the Calloway sisters' finances, a detail that settled cold and unwelcome in Odessa's stomach. "He's not the kind of man who lets a mystery sit unsolved," Ezekiel warned. "Especially not when there's money in the solving of it." The second ally arrived less gently. A young deputy named Corwin Ashby rode out to the Calloway homestead on a gray afternoon in late October, ostensibly to check on the sisters' welfare at the county sheriff's request, though it became clear within minutes that his true purpose was something closer to a debt he felt obligated to settle in person. "Your father pulled me out of the river when I was a boy of 16, half drowned and past the point most men would have bothered trying," Corwin said, standing awkward and earnest in their kitchen doorway. "I never got the chance to thank him properly before he passed, and it has sat wrong with me ever since. If there is trouble coming for this family, I would consider it a personal failing to let it arrive without warning." "What kind of trouble?" Ruth asked carefully. "The Reverend Josiah Pruitt has been meeting privately with your brother Marcus these past 2 weeks, Corwin said. "I do not know the substance of it, only that Pruitt has a reputation in 3 counties for finding families in debt and offering to settle their troubles in exchange for land, and he does not typically involve himself with a family unless there is something worth taking." The name meant nothing to Odessa yet, though it would come to mean a great deal within the month. Reverend Josiah Pruitt ran the county's largest church and sat on the board of the regional bank besides, a man whose respectability had never once been questioned in Larkspur County, despite whispered rumors, never proven, about tenant families who had lost their land to him under circumstances nobody cared to examine too closely. Corwin lingered longer than his errand strictly required, accepting a cup of coffee he did not need and asking after the sisters' welfare with a thoroughness that made Ruth's cheeks warm despite the cold seeping through the door. He spoke of their father plainly, without the awkward pity most townsfolk offered, describing the exact bend of the river where Walton Calloway had pulled him from the current as a boy, half convinced at the time that he was already drowned. "He never once brought it up after," Corwin said. "Not to me, not to anyone in town, far as I could tell. I only learned the full account from my own mother, years later. That was the kind of man your father was. Did the hardest thing a person could do for a stranger, and never once used it to make himself look large in front of others." "He was the same about most things," Ruth said softly. "We are only now learning how much." The economic skirmish came in November, when Whitcomb, having failed to pry information loose through gentle inquiry, attempted a more direct approach. He filed a claim at the county courthouse, asserting that the sisters owed him for supplies extended on credit the previous spring, a debt that existed only on paper he had drawn up himself, counting on two young women with no legal standing and no brothers willing to defend them, to simply pay rather than fight a claim they could not disprove. Odessa did not pay it. She rode into town with Ezekiel Marsh beside her as a witness and presented the county clerk with a ledger her father had kept meticulously for years. Every purchase and payment recorded in his careful hand, proving beyond dispute that the Calloway family had settled every account with Whitcomb's store in full as of the previous February.
"My father was many things,"
Odessa told the clerk, loud enough for the small gathered crowd of onlookers to hear clearly.
"But he was never a man who left a debt unpaid. I would ask that this court examine which of us is the more careless with the truth, Mr. Whitcomb or myself."
The claim was dismissed within the week, and word spread through Larkspur County that the Calloway twins were not the easy, friendless targets everyone had assumed them to be. It was a small victory, but it was theirs, earned through nothing but careful record-keeping and the nerve to stand in a courtroom without flinching. And it would prove to matter a great deal more than either sister understood at the time. Walking out of the courthouse that afternoon, Odessa felt something unfamiliar settle over her, a steadiness she had not known she possessed until she had been forced to use it. Ruth walked beside her in silence for half the road home before finally speaking.
"You sounded like him in there,"
Ruth said.
"Father, I mean. The way you laid out the ledger, point by point, and did not raise your voice once, even when Whitcomb started blustering." "I did not think I had it in me,"
Odessa admitted.
"But something in me remembered watching him do the same thing years back when a cattle buyer tried to short-change him at market. I suppose it stayed with me longer than I realized." "Then perhaps we are both more like him than we knew,"
Ruth said, and for the first time since their father's death, the words did not carry grief so much as a quiet, growing pride. The full truth of what was coming arrived through an elderly woman named Prudence Otway, who had lived alone at the edge of town for as long as anyone could remember, and was regarded by most of Larkspur County as more legend than neighbor. She had known their mother before the fever took her, had known their father since before either sister was born, and she came to the Calloway homestead one bitter evening in early December with a warning that changed everything. "Reverend Pruitt has been buying up debt notes on failing homesteads for 11 years, Prudence said, settling into a chair by the fire with the unhurried certainty of a woman who had seen enough of the world to no longer be afraid of much in it. "He does it quiet, through men like Whitcomb who owe him favors, and once he holds enough paper on a family's debts, he forecloses through the bank he sits the board of, and takes the land for a fraction of its worth. Your brother Marcus sold him something 2 weeks past. I do not know what, but I know Marcus rode out of this county with considerably more money than a man selling off a few head of cattle ought to have."
"What did he sell?"
Ruth asked, though some cold part of her had already guessed. "Knowledge," Prudence said simply. "Marcus knew your father better than either of you give him credit for, whatever he pretended in front of the courthouse. He knew Walton Calloway was not a man who died leaving his daughters with nothing. I expect he sold Pruitt exactly that suspicion, and I expect Pruitt
intends to find out for himself what your father hid before this winter is through." Odessa sat very still, watching the fire, turning the old woman's words over until they settled into something hard and certain in her chest. "How do you know all this, Prudence? You do not go to church. You do not do business with the bank." "I have lived in this county longer than most anyone still breathing," Prudence said, a faint, weary smile touching her mouth.
People forget an old woman is listening because they forget an old woman is anything at all. I have buried 2 husbands and outlived every soul who ever underestimated me for it. I hear a great deal more than folks intend for me to hear, sitting quiet in the back pew of a church I no longer believe in, watching which men whisper to which other men after the service ends. "Why tell us now?" Ruth asked. "Why not before?" "Because before now, it was only suspicion," Prudence said. "Now it is a certainty, and certainty is worth riding through cold to deliver. Your father did me a kindness once too, girls, long before either of you were born. I do not forget kindnesses, not even the small ones." She would not say more on the matter that night, no matter how Ruth pressed her, and left before the last of the daylight failed, her parting words settling over the sisters like a held breath neither of them wanted to release. "Watch the weather," she said from the doorway. "A man like Pruitt does not move in fair weather when witnesses are easy to find. He waits for a storm." The confrontation came on the 12th of December, during the worst blizzard Larkspur County had seen in 6 years. Snow falling thick enough to erase the road between the Calloway homestead and town within an hour. Wind howling loud enough to swallow the sound of a man's approach until he was nearly at the door. Odessa had felt the trouble coming before Pruitt ever arrived. Some old instinct inherited from a father who had spent a decade watching for exactly this kind of danger. She had banked the fire high, checked the bar on the door twice, and set Ruth to watching the road from the window, though there was little enough to see through the driving snow. When the first shape finally emerged from the white, dark against the gray of the storm, her stomach dropped with the certainty of a woman who had been waiting for bad news and finally saw it arrive. Reverend Josiah Pruitt arrived with 3 hired men and a wagon. Having tracked rumors of the Callaways' unexplained prosperity to their obvious conclusion. And he did not bother with the pretense of neighborly concern that Whitcomb had once offered. "I know there is something beneath that barn," Pruitt said, standing in the doorway with snow melting off his black coat, his voice pleasant in the specific way Ezekiel had once warned Ruth to distrust above all else. "Your brother was quite forthcoming, once properly compensated. I would rather we settle this like civilized people. Show me what your father hid, and I will see that you are both compensated fairly for it. There is nothing beneath that barn but rot," Odessa said, standing between Pruitt and the doorway with a steadiness that surprised even her. "I do not believe you," Pruitt said, and something cold and final entered his voice. "And I am not inclined to leave this property until I have seen for myself." Ruth's hand found her sister's in the dark of the doorway, fingers cold and trembling. and Odessa gripped it hard, willing her own steadiness into the both of them. Because there was no one else standing between this house and the men crowding the yard beyond it. The wind screamed against the shutters. Somewhere behind Pruitt, one of his hired men shifted his weight uneasily, glancing back toward the storm as though already regretting the wages that had brought him out into it. What happened next unfolded fast and loud against the roar of the storm outside. Pruitt's hired men moved toward the barn, despite Ruth's furious shouting. And it was Ezekiel Marsh, arriving through the blinding snow, with Corwin Ashby beside him, having ridden out the moment Prudence Otway warned them both of exactly what night Pruitt intended to make his move, who reached the barn first and blocked the door bodily, rather than let armed strangers descend into a hidden room that held everything the sisters had left in the world.
"Deputy Ashby," Pruitt said, his composure fraying visibly at the sight of a lawman standing beside the very family he had come to rob. "This is a private matter between myself and the Calloway family."
It stopped being private the moment you brought 3 armed men onto their property in a blizzard,
Corwin said, his voice carrying clear and hard over the wind.
"I would suggest, Reverend, that you and your men ride back to town before this storm makes that ride impossible, and that you consider very carefully what the county judge will make of a man of your standing threatening 2 women alone on their own land."
Pruitt's men, never particularly loyal to a cause beyond their wages, exchanged uneasy glances at the mention of a judge, and one of them, a younger man with his collar turned up hard against the cold, took a full step back from the barn door without waiting for instruction, some private calculation already turning against his employer. It was Whitcomb, arriving late and unexpected through the storm with a wagon of his own, who tipped the confrontation entirely, though not in the direction Pruitt had hoped.
"I want no part of this," Whitcomb said, dismounting with visible reluctance, his earlier greed apparently outweighed by the sight of a lawman and a witness both. "Reverend, you told me this was a simple business matter. You did not tell me it would come to threats in a blizzard." "Get back on your horse, Presley," Pruitt snapped. But the damage was already done. The fragile alliance between 2 men who had never trusted each other fully, cracking apart under the weight of witnesses and weather both. The storm broke the standoff more thoroughly than any argument could have. A sudden, violent gust tore the barn's loose door from its remaining hinge, and in the chaos of the moment, Pruitt's own horse, spooked by the sound, reared hard enough to throw him into the snow, and by the time his men had gathered him up, bruised and furious, and humiliated in front of witnesses who would carry the story back to town by morning, the fight had gone out of the confrontation entirely. "This is not finished," Pruitt said, hauled back onto his horse by one of his own men, blood at his temple from the fall. "It is finished," Corwin said flatly. "I will be filing a report with the county judge first thing the road's clear, Reverend, and I expect the board of your bank will have questions of their own once word gets out how you spent this evening." Pruitt and his men rode back into the storm and did not return. The blizzard broke 2 days later, leaving Larkspur County buried under nearly 3 feet of snow, and the Calloway homestead standing exactly as it had before, the hidden room beneath the barn undiscovered, the sisters' secret intact. But something else had shifted in those 2 days that neither sister could have predicted. Word of the confrontation spread through town despite the weather, carried by Whitcomb himself,
who found it suddenly convenient to distance himself entirely from Reverend Pruitt's schemes by telling anyone who would listen exactly what he had witnessed that night. And by the time the roads cleared enough for travel, the county judge had already opened an inquiry into Josiah Pruitt's decade of quiet foreclosures. Marcus never returned to Larkspur County. Word reached the sisters months later, second-hand through a trader passing through, that he had lost the money Pruitt paid him within a season to bad debts of his own, and that Dade had parted ways with his brother somewhere along the rail line, ashamed enough of what they had both done to send, eventually, a short and clumsy letter of apology that Ruth read 3 times before deciding, quietly, to forgive him. Odessa did not forgive so easily, but she did not need to. She had never needed her brother's approval to survive, only their absence, and the winter had proven she and Ruth could manage a great deal more than either brother had ever given them credit for. Spring came slow to Larkspur County that year, but it came. Odessa and Ruth used a portion of their father's gold to buy back 2 of the milk cows their brothers had sold off, purchased seed enough to plant the fields their brothers had abandoned, and hired Ezekiel Marsh, at fair wage and his own insistence, to help rebuild the barn properly, this time with a cellar door that no longer needed hiding beneath a decade of straw and dust. Corwin Ashby visited often enough that even Prudence Otway, watching from her chair by the sisters' fire on Sunday afternoons, began to comment dryly that the young deputy's interest in the Calloway welfare had outlasted any reasonable definition of duty. Presley Whitcomb, having lost most of his standing in town after his role in Pruitt's scheme became common knowledge, sold his store to a family from the east and left Larkspur County before the summer solstice, unmourned by anyone who had done business with him. Reverend Josiah Pruitt fared worse still. The county judge's inquiry uncovered 11 separate families across 3 counties who had lost land to his quiet foreclosures over the preceding decade, and though he never faced criminal charges for lack of a law precisely suited to punish what he had done, the regional bank removed him from its board within the month, and his congregation dwindled to a handful of the truly devoted by the time the leaves turned again that autumn. Prudence Otway continued to visit every fortnight through the following year, teaching Ruth the particular art of preserving vegetables through methods older than anyone else in the county still remembered, methods that would, in time, fill the shelves of the rebuilt cellar with the sisters' own harvest rather than their father's decade-old stores. She never spoke again of how she had known so precisely what Pruitt intended that bitter December night, and neither sister ever asked, content to accept her friendship without demanding an accounting of everything she carried in her long memory. By the following autumn, the Calloway homestead stood restored, its fields planted, its barns sound, its future no longer dependent on the mercy of brothers who had never deserved the trust their father once placed in them. Odessa kept her father's 2 letters folded together in a small wooden box beside her bed, reading them on the anniversary of his death each year, not out of grief alone anymore, but out of a steady, grateful understanding that a quiet man who rarely spoke of love had spent 10 years proving it in the only language he trusted enough to use. The hidden room beneath the barn stood empty by then, its shelves cleared, its chest returned to daylight, but the sisters left the trapdoor in place all the same, a reminder built into the floor of everything their father had managed to protect without ever once being asked to. They spoke of him often in that rebuilt barn, not with the raw grief of that first terrible autumn, but with something steadier, the particular fondness that comes from finally understanding a person fully after they are gone, piecing together a life from the evidence they left, rather than the words they were too careful to say aloud while living.
Out past the tree line at the edge of the property, where the Callaway land met open country, a hawk that had nested there every spring since before either sister was born circled once over the rebuilt barn roof and rose higher into a sky gone clear and endless. The same sky that had watched two frightened young women descend into the dark 11 months before and climb back out changed. And the same sky, Odessa liked to think, that had watched their father plan for exactly this moment across 10 quiet years, trusting that his daughters would prove strong enough to find what he left them, and stronger still to keep it.